Kia ora koutou katoa, ko John Reid toko ingoa, and welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tawara Aotearoa. I'm John Reid, part of the Water New Zealand Climate Change Group, and with me is group member Hannah Edmond and David Riley from Anglian Water. Kia ora, Hannah and David.
Kia ora, John.
Hi, John.
It's great to have you both with us. This is the third in our series of 4 podcasts, so we're aiming to unpack some of the key issues that we, the water sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand, needs to tackle if we're to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Timing is critical. We know that the water sector is poised for huge investment in infrastructure. This means we have some crucial opportunities to set in place pathways that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But if we get it wrong, we could risk locking in carbon emissions for years to come. Recently, our climate change group produced a guide, Navigating to Net Zero, Aotearoa's water sector low carbon journey, to help provide some practical answers to how we can meet our net zero carbon emissions targets. Over the 4 episodes, we're discussing the journey and context of the carbon emissions targets, the importance of developing a baseline, forecasting, and some more examples. So we're looking to see what's being done by some organisations that are already down the track on their carbon emissions journey, including thinking about culture change and what we might need to do within our organisations and what's happening overseas. So today we're very pleased to have David Riley with us. David is head of carbon neutrality at Anglian Water, and he's been involved in leading their carbon neutral program of work. Just so that our people listening in New Zealand can get a sense of scale, Anglian Water has 7 million customers, which is more than the population of New Zealand. And if its total pipe network of 38,000 kilometres was laid end to end, it would reach all the way from where David is sitting in England to New Zealand and back again. So just to give a sense of scale of the type of operation that Anglian Water is operating.
Kia ora, David. It's really great to have you here with us today. I guess I wanted to start off with the fact that Anglian Water stand out globally, and there's a lot of talk around the amazing mahi work that you guys have been doing over in the UK around carbon over the last 10, 15 years. Maybe longer, you can correct me on those timeframes. But can you tell us about that amazing journey that you've been on with Anglian Water, and especially around the implementations of new strategies to achieve net zero?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Hannah and John, for the opportunity. Our carbon journey probably started in around about 2006, and it's great when you work for a leading organisation with the same mindset and the same ambitions that you have as an individual, and that's the case with myself and Anglian Water, and also our supply chain. And back in 2006, it was we developed a strategy and recognised that both climate change and population growth were 2 of our most significant challenges going forward. And therefore, it's about what do we do about those challenges rather than simply writing a report.
Which I guess is the big thing that we all talk about quite frequently, isn't it? The report that then sits on a shelf, but what do we do in terms of actually implementing things and coming up with plans that can be implemented and people can see that vision?
Indeed, it's almost having as part of the DNA of the organisation and the culture that is created to allow for action to be taken. So that it's just no longer acceptable to design and build our assets with high levels of carbon built into them for now and in the future. And so that, it's almost jumping to where we are today in terms of that is the position of our organisation, and that's taken time to build up, and comes back to that leadership position in understanding really why this was important. So from a regional aspect, we recognise that we get about 2/3 of the average annual rainfall of water companies in the UK, about 600 millimetres a year. 30% of our region is below sea level. And we've got one of the fastest growing populations. So when you start to combine all that together to ensure we're providing that service to our customers, it was quite a critical step back in 2006 to really think through how do we go about significantly reducing our emissions? How do we actually take those first steps?
Yeah, and climate change is forefront in all of those things you've just talked about in terms of your challenges.
It is, and believe it or not, in 2006, the narrative was still, does climate change exist? Can we actually believe that? That was the narrative, and it was quite a sway of opinion to say this, this isn't true. Why are we focusing on this? And in reality, we weren't in our region being impacted by climate change at that point in time. How things have changed so quickly. And so therefore, to put that convincing narrative forward in terms of action we needed to take, we couldn't just rely on the fact of we are taking actions to reduce carbon. We had to bring in other levers as well to create that environment where we brought the organization, individuals, and our supply chain along with us. And one of those things that we did initially was to recognize that carbon also links into business efficiency and cost. So where we were reducing energy, where we were reducing the use of materials, we were reducing cost in how we were delivering and operating our assets. And I would say that was quite a strong lever that we pulled early on in the process.
Just sort of going back to what it would have been like in 2006, and you said, like, people didn't really even know if climate change existed. How easy was it then for people to understand the need to change? How hard was it to change those attitudes over that period since 2006?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. And looking back, one of the things that I didn't do was start conversations around we are taking these actions as a consequence of reducing our impacts on the climate. I didn't actually probably mention climate change too much at the start of any conversations. And when I joined Anglian Water, I ran a number of masterclasses to really explain what climate change actually is and what do we actually mean by climate change. So more volatile weather events, so almost trying to explain to colleagues how will extreme rainfall events, how will extreme storm events, how will heat waves impact on the assets that we operate. And it was almost starting from that viewpoint to get a sense and create a picture of the impacts that we would see across our network. And then it was then taking the steps towards, okay, so if we need to take action, what sort of actions can we take? So what would be a design for a traditional treatment works? What will be the design for commissioning a new water main before 2006? And where are the carbon hotspots where we can start to take some actions almost immediately and start to bring in some actual practical examples? And by doing that, I also recognised key individuals in the business who were forward-looking at that point in time, especially within our engineering community, who got this and were able to bring in some of the concepts, ideas, and innovations that they were already starting to see in this space.
So that's interesting. So was it a case of you were sort of looking beyond the barriers, I guess, to see those people who already, I don't know, could get it, could influence the rest of your business, rather than sort of, there's the difference between concentrating on the barriers and how you overcome them, or actually just leaping forwards with people that can just take the solutions and run with it. Do you see what I mean? There's sort of a bit of a difference there, and which approach sort of works best.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're talking about science, aren't we? And the science of climate change and how we influence through science. I'm a great believer in the Pareto rule of 80-20, and that has rung true through my career so many times. And what I generally found when looking and talking about climate change and influencing different teams and the meetings that I was in, that there's always 20% of the individuals in the room who were naysayers. What are we doing this for? Why am I here? I've got plenty of other things to be getting on with. And it was almost, okay, fine, just block those out. I'm going to focus on the 80% that I know can do some great things in the future and need to influence and nudge in the right direction to be taking action. So it almost comes back to that point, John, about focusing on those that individuals who are willing to listen and have a sponge mentality of wanting to absorb information and then make up their own decision, make up their own mind.
And do you think that's changed over time? Like, I guess in Aotearoa here, we've seen floods up in Auckland and out in the East Cape. We've seen floods even today down in the south of the South Island. So right down. We're also at the same time looking at potential droughts in the Wellington region with the lack of rainfall over the winter to refill all of the aquifers and the reservoirs. I guess it feels very forefront and central here where we are, but I'm wondering whether you're seeing that that's changed some of those attitudes, or do you think it's something that's also part of this, I guess, hard work that you've been putting in over the years?
I think that since 2006, we've built some good momentum in our business, and I'll come back to that. The linkage into reducing carbon, reducing cost, which when we were running quite an extensive capital program of £2 to £3 billion every 5 years, and not having enough money for everything that we needed to build, reducing cost was an imperative that really got high level support, along with the understanding around environmental benefit. I've seen that change, unfortunately, because the evidence around the impacts on our infrastructure and on society is now in the news headlines almost every single day. And going back 10 years, that wasn't the case. Now, yes, we've got social media, and therefore these stories do spread very, very quickly. And I think we're all aware about what's happening on the global stage almost in real time from the social media that we do have, that 24/7 news outlet. But actually, what we are seeing is impacts on the region that we operate in, and it was really sad to see the storm event in Auckland, and I did speak to some individuals in water care who I know, just to ensure that see that they're okay, and understanding the massive impact that had. And in the UK, last year we had our highest temperature recorded, and that was actually in Lincolnshire, in our region, of over 40 degrees C. Now, when I was looking at climate scenarios only 6 or 7 years ago, and I was talking to design engineers to say we need to be thinking about how we design our assets to at least 35 degrees C, and maybe that would last around 10 days. In that short period of time, we've already been hit by 40 degrees C, and seeing how our assets started to struggle with that. Now, in that same year, we also had an extreme cold weather event as well. So that caused flooding, and it caused burst mains, and it caused all sorts of different impacts. So to go into a position where we've got extreme heat and extreme cold over the same 12-month period, and then aligning that to climate change. So I think Hannah, it is a case that we are now seeing that, and the evidence is upon us, and therefore the challenge now is it already too late, and should I do something because these things are already happening, and should we just be focusing on climate adaptation rather than actually reducing how much carbon we are emitting? It's it's got to be an and yes, there's still plenty that we can be getting on with, and it's just created the urgency.
Just sort of on those challenges for you, just I guess more broadly across the whole of the UK water industry, are there any particular challenges that you're seeing, if it's sort of from a climate change perspective?
Yes, yes, lots of challenges.
So what are the key ones, or just trying to get just for comparison for people here in New Zealand?
Yeah, and I think that the key difference that I'm aware of is about the regulatory regime that we operate under. So we have a regulator, Ofwat, and every 5 years we put together a business plan. We submit that business plan to our regulator, and they tell us what we can actually spend and what we can't spend, and impact on customer bills, etc. With regard to the regulator, they were a very forward-looking regulator, probably before 2010, where they had a climate team, and they worked really collaboratively with the industry in terms of creating things like a carbon accounting workbook, where all companies were measuring carbon in the same way. Really proactive, and a lot of great work. there was then a shift in regulation to more of a risk-based approach, and those teams sort of disappeared from the regulator. And we had a period of time where carbon wasn't actually mentioned and climate change wasn't mentioned in business plans. Anglian Water still recognised the importance of this and still actually had it as part of our business plan and still part of our reporting on an annual basis and a core of what we did and do. But probably after 2019, we've seen the regulator shift again and now is really proactive in this space. And looking at the submission of our business plan for 25 to 30, the regulator are now starting to ask for low carbon solutions and low carbon investments. And that's brilliant. That's fantastic. What they've also done is create an innovation fund as well. So we all put money into a pot and then we bid for submissions. And there's some great examples of low carbon innovation where it's a collaboration between water companies and wider suppliers to actually look at really unique innovations that would not be self-funded or wouldn't happen if it wasn't for that innovation fund. And I can give plenty of examples of those as well. So one of the key things that have been a challenge over the time, John, is the funding piece. So that we have put the specific investment and the funding around what I would say is non-commercially or non-energy related carbon. So emissions of nitrous oxide and methane as process emissions is a great example of that, because there's no cost to those emissions, but yet there is a massive investment required to reduce both methane and nitrous oxide down. That I am now confident and smiling because the direction of travel is very, very good, because we are focusing on those areas. The challenge is the commitment continues when affordability becomes a real challenge again.
Well, that sounds really interesting, David. Have you got any examples you'd like to share with us here now?
Yeah, sure. So examples around operational carbon are the simple ones that we will commonly see, and things like renewable energy. So in 2009, Anglian Water were generating around about 26 gigawatt hours of energy out of a consumption of around 700 gigawatt hours from combined heat and power from biomethane from our sludge treatment centres. That's now reached around about 130 gigawatt hours from CHP, and now we're looking at gas to grid. So rather than generating heat and power, it's actually exporting biomethane into the grid, where low carbon heat is something that we're looking at. If I go back to the early days, encouraging competition in our supply chain delivers some really interesting results. And an example of that is that if we were to build a traditional concrete tank, in situ concrete tank, it's quite carbon intensive with regard to the cement, the structural steel, etc. And we had the plastic tank industry say, actually, we've got a solution now where we're lower carbon than that in situ concrete tank. And we went, great, okay, let's try it. And we started to install some tanks, plastic tanks. Concrete industry didn't like that. So they came back and said, well, how do we get this business back? Well, if you reduce carbon in your assets or how we design them, then we can do that. And they came back with the obvious around precast concrete and putting in their cement replacement materials. And that, that was great, because that meant actually shifting back towards precast concrete panels. That was then the lower carbon solution. Plastics industry didn't like that. So they came back and said, how do we get this business back? Well, how are you going to reduce your carbon down? Well, we're already reusing renewable energy to make the plastics. We're already doing this. And we said, well, what about the wider impacts of using tanks? And they said, well, when you're actually excavating and making the to install those tanks, you have to put in a large amount of aggregate material to provide the lateral support for the tank. If we can actually specify a bucket that the ground conditions provide the lateral support, you can get away with not using the hardcore. That will remove a lot of carbon out of the asset. So we went back to plastic tanks again, because we changed how we understood the carbon hotspots and aspects of how those assets were going to be installed. So that's a good example of the stretch that we can give to the supply chain in terms of when carbon is part of the narrative and part of the challenge, and it wasn't just about cost. And then going forward around the innovation challenge, some of the really exciting projects that we're involved with at the moment is one about what we call the triple carbon reduction, and that is where on some of our water recycling centres, we're looking at combining reducing process emissions through using a technology called MABR. So rather than firing fine bubble air into a aeration lane, it's basically using a membrane approach, but using oxygen rather than air to reduce the energy required, and then also using electrolyzer, creating the link into hydrogen. So we've got a pilot starting to be constructed right now where we're reducing the energy consumption, we are reducing the nitrous oxide emissions for process emissions, and we are generating hydrogen, which we're then providing to a transport company to reduce how much diesel is used in HGVs. So that's a fascinating example of how we're thinking in that way. Another example is that there are a couple of very large glass houses that were built in our region that can grow probably about 10% of UK tomatoes. Traditionally, a glass house would use a gas-fired boiler to provide the heat, but a clever engineer recognised that actually the effluent discharge has probably a delta of about 7 or 8 degrees warmer than the receiving water. We take that heat through a heat pump and heat exchanger and provide that heat to the glass house. So they're almost that circular economy thinking comes into play to avoid that gas-fired boiler. I could spend the next hour talking about great examples I've seen our engineers come up with, and that's why this is a brilliant area to work in, and that's where when an organisation has a carbon lens rather than just a cost lens or a time lens, that's when the magic starts to happen in terms of these innovations coming through.
And
That's
I can hear the
fascinating.
excitement.
And
Sorry,
yeah,
John.
it's just very, very, very inspiring. So it's awesome. Thank you, David.
You can hear the excitement in your voice as you're talking about it, and they are really, really cool examples of what's coming across. I also love the fact that when you're talking about the triple carbon, you're talking actually that's whole systems thinking. That's us, impacting within what's going on in the transport sector, which we all know is one of the big ones that's emitting carbon, and everybody's struggling to get their head around how that's going to start reducing. But it's also helping on our side with the water and water treatment. I think that's
Absolutely
fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
How to get yourself buzzing. There you go. If you've got ideas out there, we're looking forward to hearing more of what's going on across New Zealand. I guess bringing it back to the journey that you guys have been on, to get to this point where we've got these amazing examples, there are clearly some cultural changes that you've started to go through. So you've mentioned there about the fact that you're involving the supply chain, you're creating that natural competition, which is driving some of that change. But what I guess I'm really curious to find out about is what you think some of maybe the top 4 of those cultural changes, or maybe there's less than that are just really, really key in that journey that you've been on since 2006.
Yeah, I think the cultural bit comes from a number of different parts. If I go top down first of all, and that's the leadership in the organisation. So within Anglian Water, when we've got investors are so passionate about ensuring that we have got a sustainable business, and they recognise the risk around climate change and the opportunities that a positive approach takes. So when you've got that management board, CEO, directors all pushing in the same direction and wanting this to happen, that's a really important part, because in the narrative that they give, in the purpose of the organisation, and the purpose of Anglian Water is to bring environmental and social prosperity to the region we serve through our commitment to love every drop. So when you've got that strong purpose in mind from the top, that's repeated time and time again, and it's not just an initiative that comes and goes through the years, that's one key thing. The other element is almost the bottom-up approach, in terms of when I've got examples and data and information to support what we are doing, and it's almost the continual narrative of here's some great things that are happening with individuals, with teams, with our suppliers, with the business, and we have supplier awards, and we do all sorts of things to ensure that the narrative is always there and understood. And we provide the tools and the knowledge and the awareness to individuals within the business to make the right decisions and be engaged and supported in terms of driving lower carbon solutions. All these things are important in terms of driving that culture forward, and having that real reason as to why this is important, which I've already explained in terms of the climate impacts on our region, and highlighting the strong correlation to our purpose. It means that this almost becomes a business as usual activity. And I would say it's almost akin to health and safety. So if we go back 20 years, health and safety was more about what actions we are taking and almost a list of rules that we follow. Now it's far more emotional to say, would I walk past an unsafe act on a site? Well, no, I wouldn't. I'd actually stop taking action, because that's now ingrained to recognize how important this is, and it's part of the emotion, and it's part of my conscious being. So it's almost translating the carbon approach and mirroring what we've done with health and safety and the lessons learned with health and safety.
Wow, that's a different way of thinking about it. I think that's fantastic, and it really rings true. You do have a lot more now where we're talking about that being the right thing to do and feeling like it's just how we do it in the health and safety space. Looking forward to us being in that same space around climate change and carbon.
Have you got any key takeaways, David, from the work you've been involved with over the last 15 to 20 years, I guess?
My key takeaway personally is that I've been in the privileged position to understand the science, understand the data, and then flow that through to what we need to do strategically as a business to drive this forward. So from a viewpoint of a data-driven, evidence-based strategy that's applied into the business, which avoids that tick box exercise as to what am I producing this number for. So that will be the first thing, to really get to grips with baselining, with the measurement piece, understanding where carbon is in the business, and then using that to drive the right actions, and ensuring that they are measured, and ensuring that there is a long-term plan and outcome in place, almost thinking with that end in mind. And the next thing comes back to the behavior change piece, because this is about behavior change, and it's understanding and spotting and promoting those individuals who are willing to ask the difficult questions in those meetings. So how many times you sit around a table and you think to yourself, I should be asking now, what are we doing about carbon? What's the carbon impact of the decisions that we are making? And how often do we sit around a table and not hear that challenge come through? So that's the second takeaway here, is to actually be brave, be belligerent, and actually take the time to ask those questions, because you will be amazed how much support you will get around that table from asking the very, very simplest of questions that others may be thinking but not taking action on.
And it also comes from that top down. If it's normal for the seniors in a business to be asking those questions, then that can normalize it for everyone. And I think, we're starting to see more of that, and it'll be great to see that continue.
I also, I guess, on a side point, love to see what our young professionals do in that space, the questions that they ask, because they come with this amazing new perspective where they haven't been in for 60 years and seen it always done this way, and can ask, why are we doing it like that?
Oh, you're right, Hannah. There's some brilliant apprentices out there and graduates in our business, and they are the ones that ask the most difficult questions. So that's spot on. Yeah.
The most difficult and sometimes the most right. I guess my big question is, what's next for you guys?
What's next is really that focus around our net zero ambitions and further reducing our capital carbon in the assets that we build. So process emissions is the key one. How do we further take out nitrous oxide and methane in what we do? How do we move away from diesel trucks? How do we further promote behind the meter renewable energy that we need in our business? And the big ones around things like concrete and steel, looking at how we use lower carbon concretes and identify and support supply chain with lower carbon steel. So all those things are still happening and moving in the right direction. The key one for me at the moment, though, is around carbon is really in reality easy to measure. It's easy to measure, easy to manage, and there are a number of metrics we can use to measure our performance. How we measure our performance in terms of resilience to climate change is something far more difficult. So as an organisation, how do I know how resilient my assets are to a changing climate? Because there's so many variables and there's so many different scenarios out there that is proving to be quite difficult. Now, things like the digital twin approach is starting to work, and we've got a project called Credo, which again is just amazing, and it working with other infrastructure providers. But that's where my mind is going at the moment, in terms of we can't just have strategies that look at carbon and adaptation in isolation. This is part of well, it's two sides of the same coin. So it's how we ensure that we give the same level of scrutiny and credibility of approach for both adaptation and mitigation.
Thanks, David. I mean, it's been fantastic talking to you, and really inspiring, actually. So, and I hope that lots of our listeners are inspired by hearing about all the great things that you've been doing at Anglian Water in relation to climate change and some of the wider issues. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to listen to this podcast. This is the third in the series, so look out for the next one. If you've got any feedback, please send it to us at Water New Zealand, best by email to media@waternz.co.nz. So thanks everyone, and see you all next time.